Yo guys, and welcome back for another Blue Protocol Star Residence video. So I know right now the SEA servers are actually coming online, and someone in chat actually last night during my stream was asking me a bunch of questions about different classes in the game. So I thought I'd go ahead and give a tier list and kind of talk about how I feel about each spec at this point in the game. Keep in mind we are at the end of season 1, and just overall, I'm just gonna put this out there, right? I am not a whale and I don't play within a group of whales. So if you're looking for, which class is going to be the best to whale on and things like that, I can give you my thoughts, but I don't actually ultimately know. Personally, if I was going to whale, I would pick any of the classes that are realistically on the S or A tier, except for maybe Lifebinder. I don't think that one realistically be worth actually going for whaling on that class, just because I don't think it'll get a lot of value. Now, your teammates would love you, getting an R5 Tina or something, but I think overall, the effect that you're going to personally feel from spending a bunch of money is going to be pretty minimal. So again, I think any of the S or A tier classes would be a decent choice if you do want to whale and spend money on the game, but also spend responsibly, right? Someone in chat, like I said last night, was kind of asking some questions and kind of got me thinking that maybe people have the wrong interpretation about what's happening in the current state of the game. And again, this is based on the end of season 1. So if you're thinking about this with season 2 information or whatever, that's going to be a bit different. So this is going to be focusing on the season 1 and going into a season 2. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with what I think are going to be the S tier classes just off the bat, and we'll go ahead and just move down accordingly after that. So I think in S tier classes, so also, just for reference, I'm going to be kind of looking at this from the standpoint of all content in the game. I'm going to be looking at the Nightmare Mode raids and then also the higher level Mastery Mode dungeons. We have done everything there is to get the actual cosmetic items and stuff like that in the game now. And so I feel like I have a pretty good idea about how these classes kind of rank. So in my opinion, there's only a couple of S tier classes. And right now, in my opinion, they would be the Skyward Win Knight spec. I know there was a lot of information going around and people were saying that the Vanguard Win Knight spec was going to be a better performer. However, from my experience, having played Skyward spec and then also seeing many Win Knights throughout my runs, I've never once seen a Vanguard Win Knight do incredible damage. They do fine damage, and in fact I'll probably put them in like A tier, maybe high B tier, something like that, but they're definitely not an S tier class, whereas Skyward spec I believe truly does belong in the S tier. There's a couple of reasons for that. So one, Skyward is one of the coolest, maybe the most iconic out of all of the abilities and specs in the game. You're flying through the sky, it's very unique looking, and people can look at you with eyes of envy. It's pretty cool, right? But maybe more importantly is you're actually like immune to a lot of damage that would happen on the ground when you're flying through the sky. And so you do have a lot more iframes than most classes do. One person that I know from my guild, his name was Ebb and Flow, and he was constantly iframing with Skyward spec to constantly stay damaging the boss, even when all the rest of us melee would have to leave. So I think that, along with its overall tankiness and damage, the highest damage I've ever seen anyone put out in the game was a whale Skyward spec that I came across. He was like 33,000 ability score or something, and he just pumped, man. It was crazy. And I've seen a lot of people 32, 33 of other specs, and none of them were like him. So he could have just been someone with hands. Definitely that's possible, but I will say normally I don't run across anyone that's bad at this spec either, which I think is kind of a telling point. So one thing I just want to say too really quickly, guys, is that there's always going to be exceptions to the rule, and if you really know your class inside and out, you're probably going to be able to perform at a decent level in most cases. And when it comes to your class, if I don't think that your class is particularly good. It's not a slight against you. Many of the people in my chat and some of the best players that I play with on a regular basis can still make these classes work. The point being, and why I'm kind of talking about this, is because realistically, if those players were on a different class, I think they would just be performing that much better, right? Because on average, these classes do seem to perform better than others, and that's just kind of the way that the game is right now. And keep in mind too, this is only temporary. This is going to be a seasonal game where there's going to be updates and they're going to change things. They're going to rebalance things. We're going to get more stats, etc. So classes that maybe aren't performing as good now will perform better likely in the future. So if you like a class, play what you like and don't worry about what I think. Okay, so the next class that I think really deserves to be in the S tier classes is going to be the Lifebind healer spec. So part of the reason why I want to make this video, and I just want to talk about my thoughts overall about the Verdant Oracle versus the Beat Performer, is they both have their plus and minuses. And to be honest, they both have a strong spec and they both have a weak spec. And based on this, you can probably feel Smite spec for me, I'm gonna put it in the D tier, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. But let's talk about Lifebinder for a moment. Lifebinder puts out the most healing in the game, bar none. Just flat out healing. Dissonance can outperform it in mass AoE scenarios, but that's usually about it, and it struggles in other scenarios where you won't be able to do damage. With that in mind, I would probably still give Dissonance an S tier rating as well. It's just a little more niche, so maybe it's like lower S tier for me, high A tier. Now, the higher you push in the mastery mode dungeons, the higher this goes, and the more these two kind of swap in between. And so there's a reason for that. The higher you go, the more of a whale you need to be, or the more damage you need to bring from other sources, right? And that other source is potentially going to be your healer. But in general, I would definitely consider these to be the two strongest support classes in the game right now, and by a significant margin. I think Concerto and Smite spec are significantly weaker. I think Concerto is better value than Smite because of what it does and the damage boost that it brings to the table, but I think I'd put it at B tier at best, whereas both of these are the S tier support specs. So let's talk a little bit more about Lifebind. So Lifebind in particular has a lot of really great utility. Their 4-set bonus gives them the ability to overheal allies and give them a shield, and they have a couple of different specs that they can play. They can play more of a passive heal over time spec, or they can play a more burst heal spec. That video is going to be coming soon if you guys want to see more about that. I'm going to make videos on the classes that I play, mainly going to be the Lifebind Verdant Oracle, the Moonstrike Thunderblade, and the Skyward Wind Knight. Those are probably going to be the ones I make. The tank one, I don't really know if I'm going to take the time to make a tank video or not, but we'll have to see. I do play Shield Knight, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. I believe both of these are pretty good for what they do. And again, Dissonance, it's more necessary later on. Dissonance is going to have more value if you're pushing higher mode mastery modes for the dungeons. But to be honest, unless it's week 1 on the raid, I'm just going to take a Lifebind for every single nightmare mode anyway. The Lifebind again has a lot of utility. That 4-set bonus that gives you the shield for overhealing, it's like 25% of your HP, so it's like pretty significant. And then on top of that, they do also bring the Blossom Charge, and that does give you the ability to stun the robots, which is really, really handy if you're doing things like the Stone Dragon, right? The Stone Dragon requires you to stun the robots on hard and nightmare mode difficulty, and so that does require you to have those utility skills, and Lifebind is perfect for this. I don't know if Dissonance has the ability to keep them stunned, but essentially Lifebind can actually solo stun those bots themselves, and it also works very well even in dungeons. So if there are packs that are going to do a lot of damage, something that's really nice that they can do is they can allow a little bit of damage to go through, stun all the mobs or interrupt all the mobs, and then do a little bit of burst healing or let their nourish procs heal over time, etc. Right? So they have a lot of utility even in those dungeons as well. And actually several of the other mechanics, including some of the summon mobs from the mastery mode, like, you know, weekly mechanics, can just be stunned and dealt with entirely by the Lifebinder as well. So the Lifebinder has a lot of utility. I think that just makes it, to be honest, my favorite support, and I would always probably choose them unless I'm trying to hit like a mastery 19 or 20 or something and I needed a Dissonance for the extra damage. So let's talk a little bit to about why I'm putting the Concerto spec and the Smite spec here. So I have come across a singular person with Smite spec in particular that was doing any kind of damage. And I mean any kind of damage. Most players playing Smite specs are doing roughly 1/4 to potentially 1/3 of the damage of an actual DPS, and they're outputting about half as much healing or less than a lifeline on average from what I've seen and what I've experienced in those raids. So in most cases, I find that not to be worth it. I'd rather just have a lifeline that is going to be able to, you know, provide more healing, literally twice as much, or in some cases more healing, or just have a dissonance. It seems like to me, Smite is not optimized very well, or maybe people aren't playing it very well, or maybe they need season 2 gear. I'm not really sure, but I don't think that they're worth playing right now unless you really love the spec, which kind of brings us to a good point. Even though I'm putting it in D tier, and I wouldn't personally bring this to very many groups, if any, to be honest. If you love the spec, you know, don't let what I'm saying dissuade you from playing it. If you love the spec, you know, find a group of friends to play with and play with them. I'm just trying to tell you from my perspective, every time I've ever grouped with a Smite spec healer, it doesn't end up going well. They're not able to output enough healing for it to be worth bringing them, and the lack of damage that they bring. It just is what it is. And in every scenario, I'd rather have one of these other two supports. For Concerto spec, I'm kind of torn. The damage increase is really good. It feels phenomenal. As a DPS player, you want to play with a Concerto spec B performer. It feels so good. Except you probably also want healing, and they don't do a lot of healing or shields. They kind of just have that Smite healer vibe, the Smite priest vibe from World of Warcraft runs, you know, the last couple expansions, etc., where you're kind of just barely living on the edge of death, you know, and sometimes that's okay, but it's not a very comfy ride, right? So it really depends on you. If you are gonna run with a Concerto, you definitely want to make sure you have like personal food so you can keep your health up and stuff like that in case you do step into something. With a Concerto, I feel like if you're playing perfect and you're not standing in any AoEs and you're dodging stuff, you'll be okay probably most of the time. But if you do end up getting cleaved or hit by something and you don't have personal food, you're probably just gonna die. And that's just kind of the way that it is. And again, in most cases, I would probably just pick one of these other two supports. Now, personally, I think that there's a place for these both in the game. And so I did want to bring up this one comment here that somebody had for me. And again, they wanted to talk about the difference between B Performer and the Verdant Oracle. And again, personally, most case scenario, I'm probably going to pick a Verdant Oracle actually over a B Performer, even though Dissonance does provide so much additional damage and they also do good healing. And the reason for that is because while they do that, there's still situations in boss fights where those B Performers can't do damage and they can't really help you. They can't really heal you, and that does end up being a bit of an issue if they're not prepared for it, right? So this requires more of the B Performer's actual personal skill and also a little bit on your part as well to make sure you're not standing in anything too bad. If you do take too many hits, much like the Concerto spec B Performer, you probably are going to die if there's not an AoE group scenario going on. However, in an AoE group scenario, like let's say the first massive pull for Goblin Mastery mode of any pretty much level, the Dissonance spec B Performer is going to do an absolute crap ton of healing there. And so even though it sounds like maybe they would have a hard time keeping up there, they actually do, and they do a lot of damage. So it really just depends on the scenario. And the part where they really struggle more often is like if you were to do Towering Ruin boss, let's say during the section with the beams, so they can't really do any damage there. So if they're not playing smart, they're not really going to be able to heal you at the same level of effectiveness. However, they do have their auto attacks, they can take an extra healing skill, they can also use their ultimate. There's a few things that they can do to work around these things, so it's not like it's not viable. It requires the player to be a little bit smarter, right? And to be honest, with a life binder, in most cases, if they can just hit their buttons, they're just going to do an absolute crap ton of healing. I wouldn't say that life binder actually requires very much personal skill. So if you're a new healer looking to heal or play a support character, this is maybe going to be a great spec for you. you're always going to do really good healing as long as you follow some kind of guide and have some idea, you know, of pressing your buttons. But other than that, like, it's just kind of like the default, pretty easy to play healing class, and I think it does a good job at that. Okay, so Iaido Slash, I'm going to put this at an A tier. And the reason why, you know, honestly, I'd be tempted to put it high B, maybe too. But I think it's okay keeping it at A. Iaido Slash is the class, you know, everyone said before the game launched that this is the class that like most people shouldn't play. And I think that that kind of turned out to be true. In most cases, most players who are playing Iaido Slash are doing pretty not good damage. However, you can do good damage. And I imagine if you were to wail to the moon, you would also do pretty good damage. But there's only been, I think, 2 players that I've ever lost to that were playing Iaido, period, as a Moonblade. And I think that that kind of speaks to something, and the difference in like personal requirement for those are pretty significant. Iaido requires you to have a lot more like personal awareness, right? I kind of like playing Moonstrike on my main character because it's kind of nice that I can DPS and talk to chat while I'm playing, or you know, whatever. We can talk about different things. I can look over at the chat and read it while we're playing. It's not really like a high like I have to pay attention, although it is kind of high APM. The damage is really, really good, and I would actually put Moonstrike into the S tier. And again, that comes from its ease of play. I think it's really easy to play and do well with Moonstrike. And then also, I think the fact that you have more freedom on your brain to do other things, whether it be, you know, I'm reading chat and stuff like that, but for a lot of players, this could be paying attention to mechs, right? Looking at the boss's health bar and seeing, okay, this mech is coming soon, this mech is coming soon, I'm going to be preparing for that. And then you're still maintaining good quality damage, where I feel like Iaido Spec requires you to maybe focus a bit more on just getting through your rotation and doing damage. And even then, like I said, the majority of Iaido Spec players are doing less damage, much less damage than I would as a Moonstrike. Okay, so this is kind of the big part of the reason why I wanted to make this. We're going to talk about Icicle Spec and Frostbeam Spec. I'm putting them both in D tier. You know, I have seen a couple of them do really good. I don't know what makes it happen. I don't know if it's just like a skill diff, maybe it's just a high skill ceiling class, maybe it's just a high whale class. But the players that I've seen doing well don't have like 30,000 ability score. The players that I see do well with Frostbeam in particular, and actually for that reason, it probably deserves to be a little bit higher, maybe B tier or something. They're usually like 28,000, 29,000, which is a little bit more than where I'm at. So maybe they have like full skill investments, or maybe a little bit more of Imagine investments, but pretty close to where my character's at. And they're usually able to somewhat keep up with me in terms of damage, but only the good ones. Most Frostbeam players and all Icicle players are going to be doing far less damage than I'm doing with Moonstrike. And again, that's part of the reason why Moonstrike is up here, I think, in the S tier classes. They do serviceable damage for Frostbeam. I don't think there's any situation where you do good damage with Icicle. And unfortunately, the way that it kind of was supposed to play out, at least according to people that I've talked to, is that Frostbeam was supposed to be like the AoE spec. However, it just kind of does the same damage, if not better, even on single target, and it also does insane AoE damage. But if you've done high level mastery mode dungeons and you know you're pushing past like 15, 16, or if you're even going higher, you know, maybe if you're doing like 19 or 20, you struggle on getting some of those AoE packs done. But to be honest, at like 16, 17, that wasn't the case. We weren't struggling with getting AoE packs done. We were struggling on getting the boss cleared before it enraged. And so in that case, single target damage matters a lot more than your AoE damage. And so I don't really think it's really worth ever taking a Frostbeam over, to be honest, many other classes. You know, the person in chat last night that kind of, you know, got me thinking about this idea, they were asking, you know, about the Frost Mage class and asking specifically about Icicle Spec. And I kind of said, look, man, you know, I know SEA servers, they just launched, you're only in level 40 gear. I would consider maybe re-rolling. And I kind of mean that to be true. Like, it is, I would say overall, the Mage class is probably the worst class in the game. And that's tying both specs to it. but at least Frostbeam can be kind of serviceable, but you're never gonna do top tier damage except for if you have an overall DPS meter, in which case it'll look inflated, right? If you look at the overall damage done in like a goblin, you know, M16 or something, it might look like, you know, Frostbeam mages are doing a lot of damage and that they're one of the best classes in the game. And the reason for that is because some classes like Moonstrike Spec example, they don't scale infinitely with the number of mobs, but other classes like Beam and Skyward Spec, they both scale infinitely with mob density. So no matter how many mobs they're doing, they're going to do even more damage. Whereas Moonstrike, like I said, hits a certain point where they don't do more damage with higher group numbers. And so, like I said, if you just look at the overall damage on a DPS meter, you might see that the Frostbeam Spec does like 70% of the damage in that first pull in Goblin Lair, but then they just slowly start losing and other classes start catching up as the dungeon goes on. And that's because they really just excel at those AoE encounters where they can just go to the absolute moon. They do have the actual ceiling, I think, damage in terms of AoE, especially for huge pulls like that. So if you want to just go really big and go ham on those AoE pulls, maybe that will be more valuable in season 2. But right now, like I said, it doesn't really seem that valuable in the current state of the game. And again, Icicle Spec, I have not seen a single Icicle Spec do good in any content. I just haven't. In every scenario, I'd rather be them playing Beam, and in every scenario I'd rather take any other class in the game. If you're bringing an Icicle Spec, I don't want to say you're kind of throwing, but to be honest, I feel like you kind of are. Single target is very similar between these two, and AoE is massively different. Like Icicle doesn't do hardly anything for AoE targets, and yeah, it's a rough time for an Icicle player. So if you are starting out and you want to play Icicle, to be honest, maybe wait for season 2 and then check out Icicle then and see if it's doing better. That would realistically be my recommendation. There was this concept that like you know, just wait for, you know, we are in level 40 gear, just wait for level 60 gear, then the mages are going to catch up, the mages are going to go to the moon, and then we're in level 60 gear, and then just wait till level 80 gear, they're going to catch up, then they're going to go to the moon. And it seems to always be this like wait and see thing with these mages in particular, and I think that that's kind of inherently a problem, right? I think this comes from people hearing what other people say over on like the CN side, where maybe they don't have the correct information, or maybe they're not thinking about it correctly or whatever. People online can just say whatever they want to say, right? Like you don't really have any reason necessarily to believe me other than this is just what I'm telling you I have experienced. So it's the same thing for someone on the CN side or whatever. And so that it's possible that like, you know, maybe they do in season 2, right? Maybe in season 2 level 100 gear, maybe mages go to the moon. I don't really know, but it seemed to be this weird copium that like at some point mages were gonna take off. Maybe at like, you know, full R5 refinements on both your imagines and your level 90 weapon and all of your gear, maybe that's when they take off or something. I don't really know, and I don't know why it's this weird copium take that like they're the top class in the game. People said it for literally the last 2 months. Mages are going to be the top class in the game. Mages, literally no. Like I don't expect them to be either. Even if you had R5 refinements on these classes, I wouldn't expect this class to suddenly start doing a bunch of damage, to be honest. Maybe it does, and I could be wrong, but I wouldn't expect a class that's performing at this point to change that drastically with just some higher level imagines. Okay, Vanguard Spec. I feel like Vanguard is actually pretty good. I would say high B tier, maybe low A tier. I haven't played it personally myself, but I never really see anybody playing either of the Wind Knight classes and doing poorly. They're doing always competitive damage, and that's a pretty good spot to be in, I think, for most classes. But I've never seen someone with Vanguard Spec go to the moon. I just haven't. Even in the 40 and 60 tiers, you know, at one time, I think in the 60 tier, they were doing like pretty good damage. They were kind of keeping up with some of these S tier classes, but ever since we got level 80 gear and our level 90 weapon, they just kind of fall further behind. So I think it's, you know, one of those things, again, maybe with higher investment, it could be a bigger deal. And if you're a whale, you know, 33, something like that, you're probably just going to pump and go to the moon anyway, even if you're one of these A tier classes. Wildpack Spec. I'm sure you guys knew this already. This was going to go in the S tier. In terms of where it goes in the S tier, I think this is actually a pretty good spot for it. And I think it's only going to get better in season 2. So Wildpack does really well right now. And at every point in the game, it was always a high contender. At level 40 gear, at level 60 gear, it was always, you know, competing for top spots if they were any good at the spec. And it's so free with being able to auto a lot of the time as well. Every single Wildpack I seem to run across for a long time was doing a lot of damage. At level 80 gear, this did kind of fall off a little bit, but keep in mind that in season 2, they're getting another Imagine, this Fox Imagine that gives them like summon damage, which is only going to make their wolves do even more damage. So I expect them to kind of be good going into season 2 as well. All right, so for Falconry, I'm going to put in the C tier. And I'll say that most Falconry that I came across weren't doing very good damage. However, occasionally I would come across a Falconry doing pretty good damage, pretty competitive damage with some of these B tier and A tier classes, not like S tier class damage, right? But at least competitive with these other, you know, middle of the pack kind of, you know, classes. And kind of the way that I look at this too is that like you have the top classes, the bottom classes, and then the middle classes. A, B, and C are all kind of similar to me personally, but you know, it's up to you guys to how you want to interpret it. I think that I would take a Frostbeam spec probably over a Falconry if I was looking at them 1-to-1, but that's because I think it kind of falls in the same category as, you know, other mages and stuff like that. You never really know what you're going to get, and they're going to do potentially okay damage, potentially not okay damage, right? So, all right, shield spec. So my experience with this, I would say, is pretty good. I think shield spec, shield knight is actually pretty strong, but I have seen recovery do some crazy stuff. Now, I haven't checked out recovery yet, which is part of the reason why I don't want to make my shield knight guide. But based on some things that I've seen recently, recovery spec seems insane. Now, I assumed that because they had their own health regeneration that they wouldn't be able to be very tanky, and that's kind of the impression the game gives you too. However, at the late game with level 80 gear and stuff like that, I have seen some recovery tanks do some crazy stuff. 29k, 28k ability score, which is like pretty similar to where I'm at. And they go in and like solo the last boss of Konamiya 17 for like the last 2 minutes by themselves. Right? They're not doing a ton of damage, but they just don't die, which is pretty insane. And I think it's worth at least exploring more of what these classes can do. I think shield spec is really solid, and I do like playing it. It feels very much like protection paladin if you've ever played like World of Warcraft. Recovery spec is not the same as protection paladin from what I've seen, but I do think it's possible at like level 80 gear that maybe it kind of goes to the moon and has like really cool stuff that it can do, just like I was saying earlier. So I've come across a couple of recovery tanks that were able to do some pretty wild stuff like what I just mentioned. So I think it's definitely worth checking out. Okay, so the other two specs, I don't really kind of know exactly where to put them. I didn't actually play heavy guard at all during my time in season 1 so far, and I genuinely wasn't grouping with them that often either. I feel like for the most part, they're probably both serviceable. Probably say because of that, I would probably put them both into A tier. I don't think I've ever come across a heavy guard and then not had, you know, the ability to clear the content because of the tank. The tank always seemed to be able to be competent if they knew what they were doing, and so it's more of a skill issue than a class issue. And the fact that they have, or at least one of these classes has the AoE pull, I think probably gives them a little more value too than most people give them credit for. However, a lot of them that I did see tried to use that as an excuse to not have Tempest Ogre. If you're playing a tank, you need to haul ass to get Tempest Ogre, okay? Haul ass. It doesn't matter if you're playing a heavy guard, doesn't matter if you're playing a shield knight, get Tempest Ogre, okay? It's a good defensive, It's really good for your dungeons. It's really good for bosses, right? There are bosses like Light Dragon that have ads that you need to use Tempest Ogre and get it over to the group without it killing people first. Tempest Ogre is a really great pick, and every tank should be going for it for their first Imagine. Period. All right, well, so this has been my kind of thoughts and feelings about the current state of the game at level 80 for level 80 gear for the current end game of season 1. Let me know what you guys think down below in the comments down there. Like the video if you guys like the video. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see more stuff like this. I'm currently working on a video that's a bit more involved. That's about how the developers need to take a look at season 1 and move on and do things better in season 2 and beyond. What the game needs to do to survive, and I'm trying to do a pretty in-depth video about that, so be on the lookout for that. Hopefully this helps some of you SEA players plan what class and what spec you want to play moving forward. I know you guys just got your servers up over there. I hope you guys are having a blast, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Peace out, guys.